Welcome to Media and Monuments, presented by Women in Film and Video in Washington, D.C. Media and Monuments features conversations with industry professionals speaking on a range of topics of interest to screen-based media makers.
Hello, everyone on Media and Monuments. I'm your host, Tara Jabbari, and today we have Michael Schulman, the author of the New York Times bestseller, Her Again, Becoming Meryl Streep. He is a staff writer at The New Yorker, where he has been contributing since 2006. His work has also appeared in The New York Times, Vanity Fair, and other publications. His latest book is Oscar Wars, A History of Hollywood in Gold, Sweat, and Tears. He lives in New York City, and he is here today on Media and Monuments. Welcome, Michael.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for coming. At the time of recording, we haven't seen the Oscars for 2024 yet, but the nominations have come up, and I do have some questions for you on your thoughts for that. But I did want to go over your book. I loved it. I love history too, and I'm a film nerd. And it was really fascinating the way that you decided to think of writing this book. Can you kind of explain what was your thought process to be like the history of what brought the Oscars?
Well, thank you. I'm so glad you enjoyed it. My concept for the book is not to tell the story of every single Oscar year and who won and who lost and what jokes were told. The idea was really to take about a dozen years, even a single category like 1951 Best Actress or 1976 Best Picture, and zoom in and tell a story of that year and what changes were going on in Hollywood, in American culture, in the movie industry. It's really intended as a kind of narrative-driven history of particular moments, delving into people's lives and what larger story the Oscars can tell us about cultural shifts. So it all started in 2017 or so. I was working on a piece for The New Yorker about the Academy in the aftermath of Oscars So White. Mm-hmm. You know, if you'll remember, that was a huge deal. It was just this hashtag movement that blew up, and in response, the Academy decided to make a real effort to diversify its membership, and they got a lot of blowback from some of the members who didn't like that. It was really something that divided, the Hollywood community in ways that we find very familiar from other parts of life. I went out there and I talked to the Academy president, Cheryl Boone Isaacs, at the time, and learned a lot about the Academy's history and sort of, beyond the awards, sort of why the Academy even exists. It was so enlightening. And then at the end of that process, I went to the Academy Awards for the first time. This was in 2017, and I was there in the press room during the envelope mix up with Moonlight and La La Land, and it was just insane. I mean, I'm an Oscar junkie, and I just couldn't believe that I was there for this incredible fluke historic moment. And to me, it was like this big Hollywood twist ending at the end of this year of racial reckoning for the Academy and institutional change. And I kind of saw that as like a story that told that spoke to what was happening in the country. This is at the same time as the 2016 election, and the rise of Donald Trump and everything that brought with it. So that was kind of where the idea for the book came about. That the idea to take particular years and just go really deep on them and see what that kicked up about the history.
Yeah, and you kind of open the book sort of explaining that's my first time ever going to the Oscars, happened to be the envelope mix up. And then you end the book that you're like, technically, like I ended, we were done with the book. And then this most recent Oscars was the infamous slap between Will Smith and Chris Rock. And it kind of opened up the race card again because of who was involved with the slap. So it kind of revisits it. And it's interesting because while I was reading it, I'm like, and after that, we have the first Asian actors to win major categories, um, and also directors and things like that. So the race thing keeps coming up and changing the whole Oscars so white conversation. But I wanted to know what your thoughts were, especially because majority of your book does go in chronological order, right?
Mhm.
But there is one section, I think it's chapter 10, but
Mhm.
where you talk about tokens in 1940, 1964, and 2002, which is when Hattie McDonald, Sidney Poitier, and Halle Berry make history, right?
Right, Hattie McDaniel for Gone with the Wind.
Going with the
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was up from the start, obviously important to talk about the racial disparities of the Oscars, and the first several decades just barely had anyone
mm-hmm.
of color, and they're still, this year's the 96th Oscars, and they're
Oh,
still firsts, sadly. I just
yeah.
interviewed Lily Gladstone, who's
Yes.
nominated for Best Actress and
Mm-hmm.
the first Native American woman in that category. And she really comes on the heels of just a smattering of people over the decades who are indigenous. That's pretty sad. There's like it's a really mixed thing for people who are the first, because they feel like, you know, why hasn't it happened sooner? How are we on the first anything after 90 something years? So yeah, obviously, uh, diversity and inclusion has been at the very forefront of a lot of the conversation about the Oscars over the
Mm-hmm.
past 10 or so years, and that's really important. And I wanted to make sure I devoted a good chunk of the book to that. But I didn't want the whole book to be about that. And part of it is how, over Oscar history, like that's our Oscar war of, the present. But in the past, there have been these major clashes over, labor relations in Hollywood,
Mm-hmm.
or the blacklist in the 1950s,
Yes.
and the Cold War, or the generation gap of the 60s. So there are different kind of battle lines that the Oscars have fallen on. Anyway, that idea for the chapter you mentioned about those three black actors who were the first winners in their categories,
Mm-hmm.
respectively, decades apart. Basically, I wanted to tell those stories, but what interested me is that when you tell those stories together, there are some really fascinating parallels.
Mm-hmm.
For one thing, you can tell that for each of those three actors, Hattie McDaniel in Gone with the Wind, Sidney Poitier in Lilies of the Field in the 60s, and then Halle Berry in Monsters Ball, um, it was a big moment. It was a moment when Hollywood could sort of pat itself on the back for
Mm-hmm.
its liberal, progressive, expansive enlightenment and mindset. And yet for the winner, it was often a pretty isolating experience. And they faced a lot of backlash, and they had the feeling of having to sort of carry the weight of an entire population on their backs. And they were sort of representing everyone and pleasing no one. And I felt, and Halle Berry has this incredible quote toward the end of that chapter where, she said in her speech in 2002, tonight, a door has been opened.
Right.
And then
Yeah.
years later, like 14 years later, in the heat of Oscars So White, she realized, well,
It
I thought the
hasn't.
door that night had been opened, but it really hadn't. No one else has walked through it. And she said she was heartbroken by that. So I wanted to dig into sort of, we've all seen like the inspiring moments of, Halle Berry crying, and, Sidney Poitier accepting his award in the 60s. And they are very inspiring moments, but they're also a little bit more complicated than that.
Yeah, that was what I really liked about what you pointed in, particularly that chapter, because you were like, they are isolated. People had so much hope, and they're like, see, it's not so white, or, there's so much hope. And then you're like, yes, but in all those decades, not a lot has changed. And you
Yeah, and
put
then it would
so,
take, 3 decades for the next person to
yes, and
win.
you put
So
so much pressure on these individuals who do not represent all Black people, let alone Black actors, because Hattie McDowell was like, I'm just playing, the servant or the maid for Scarlett O'Hara, but we are not all servants, and she always got some flack for playing that role. And so it was very interesting, but to your point, there were two things. So it's been a while since I had read this, because I reached out to you before the holidays, before the new year. So I was like, oh, I got to reread it before we went. But before I did, I was like, what are things that I really took from it that stuck with me? And two things really came up other than the chapter that we just talked about. One was also the generational gap, like we were just talking about, that we touched on, is like in the late 1960s when Gregory Peck was the Academy president,
Yeah.
and him and Candace Bergman, it turned out, kind of teamed up because the Academy and everyone was kind of older, and all these independent young guys, filmmakers, felt like they weren't being seen and didn't really care about the Academy. And she's like, well, if you want them to get involved, you got to get, they sort of teamed up. And then it kind of changed the trajectory of who got nominated and who won Oscars for the next couple decades, right? So that was kind of cool to learn about it, and to see also like that diversity. Like, you needed the generations to work together. Can you talk a little bit more
Yeah,
about
I
that?
mean that whole episode was a real precursor to what happened after Oscars So White. And in fact, when the Academy under Cheryl Boone Isaacs in 2017 started making this initiative to diversify their membership, they pointed to Gregory Peck as a precedent. So what happened was Gregory Peck, of course, probably most famous as Atticus Finch in To Kill a Mockingbird, which a few years after that he became Academy president, and he was kind of the liberal elder statesman of Hollywood. He was extremely well respected, and yet he could see that the Academy was behind the times. The movies were changing very rapidly. There was a new youth audience who didn't go for the kind of stuff that Gregory Peck was in. They
Right.
were into The Graduate and 2001: Space Odyssey and Rosemary's Baby and foreign films and stuff like that. And they didn't care about the Oscars, and they weren't represented at the Oscars. And so he very wisely thought that there was a need for serious reform. A lot of the people who were in the Academy and voting for the Oscars were people who had been at the height of their careers in the 30s. And so he was thinking about that around 1969. And meanwhile, Candace Bergen, who we all know now as, Murphy Brown, or maybe you know her from like, Book Club or something. She was a 23-year-old starlet and kind of it girl. And she was the daughter of a famous ventriloquist, Edgar Bergen. So she'd grown up in Hollywood. She knew a lot of, she grew up like knowing, people like Cary Grant or whatever. And she wrote to Gregory Peck in a letter that I found preserved in his papers in the Academy Library in Beverly Hills, saying basically, the Academy is full of antiquities who are gumming up the world of motion pictures, and you need some new blood. And can I please go out and recruit some people, some of my young hip friends like Dennis Hopper and Peter Fonda, who had just made Easy Rider, to get involved and be in the Academy. And Peck wrote her back and said, yeah, please do it. And she did. And, she brought him some of the leading lights of this sort of what we call the new Hollywood.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, Peck was devising a plan to essentially demote people to non-voting status who hadn't worked in movies for 7 years. So that was the more controversial part, because he also, in his papers at the Academy Library, are all the hate mail that he got from people saying, please don't kick me out. Here are my credits. Like, I'm still relevant. And like Atticus Finch in To Kill a Mockingbird, he was taking this sort of principled stand that did not make him very popular. But it was a really transformative moment for the Academy, and it set the stage for what happened in 2017.
Yeah, well, it was also interesting because I also think it helped. My understanding also kind of launched also the One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, winning the big, what is it, the big five, Best Picture,
Yeah,
president.
yeah.
Like, and if it wasn't for that team of Candace and Gregory, like, didn't it would not have allowed for all the young ones and for that to happen and all that stuff. So it was really interesting. That's how I understood it. Or
Yeah, I mean, that was a moment when the movies were changing
yeah.
so dramatically.
Hmm.
And, in 1969, the winner of Best Picture was Oliver, which was rated G. The
Right.
next year it was Midnight Cowboy, which was rated
X.
X. So to go from G to X in one year is pretty dramatic. And, I have to say, if you look at the Academy Awards of the 70s, they are pretty sort of on the ball in terms of where movies were headed.
Hmm.
You have, winners like The French Connection and The Godfather and Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and stuff like that.
And then the other part that I kind of was thinking of was the 90s, and particularly Harvey Weinstein, and how he kind of changed how voting happens. And it sort of was like all the wooing and dining and all the campaigning, because Steven Spielberg, who had been working for longer, and it was all more about the craft and the art, um, everyone was expecting, particularly the year, what is it, 98, for Saving Private
Yeah,
Ryan to win. And you were
yeah,
like,
99. So
99.
Saving Private Ryan came out in summer of 1998, and everyone just thought, okay, this is the Best Picture winner. Obviously, it's this
Hmm.
big Spielberg war epic, and it was, it was the front runner
Yeah.
for most of the year. Then at the very end of 98, Weinstein released Shakespeare in Love,
Hmm.
and suddenly the race got a lot more interesting, and the campaigning, thanks to Weinstein, got a lot more aggressive. He had honed this campaign playbook over the course of the 90s with movies like Pulp Fiction and The English Patient, and he basically pulled out all the stops for Shakespeare in Love, whether it was placing a ton of ads in Variety and The Hollywood Reporter, or kind of, putting Gwyneth Paltrow everywhere,
Hmm.
calling, his staff would call voters and like, make sure they watch the movie, ask them how they like the movie. He would like seek out pockets of voters in obscure places. What made it really controversial and really ugly was that DreamWorks, which produced Saving Private Ryan, heard this rumor through the grapevine that Weinstein was bad mouthing Saving
Mm.
Private Ryan. Like, he was negative campaigning. Specifically, he was saying, "Oh, the only good part of the movie is the first 20 minutes of this, the D-Day sequence, and then it just becomes the standard World War II movie." Weinstein, of course, always denied that. I spoke to the person who said she told DreamWorks that exact thing. Like, she heard it from Weinstein. She told DreamWorks. Um, and then DreamWorks felt like, oh my gosh, we're being attacked,
Right.
basically. And so they had to campaign even harder. They started complaining in the press about what Weinstein was doing. And then the campaign became the story, and Weinstein became the
Mm.
story.
Got it.
Um, and then the movie won. Shakespeare in Love won. And
Mm.
people in Hollywood were flabbergasted. Basically, they said, we're not going to let this happen again. We're not going to let Weinstein, this asshole from New York, come and like steal our Oscars again. So the next year, DreamWorks had Gladiator. No, not Gladiator. It was American Beauty that year. Then they had Gladiator the next year, and they
Right.
won both because they said, okay, we're going to take the Weinstein playbook and double it, and we're going to hire a bunch of strategists to work for us, and we're going to place even more ads, and we're going to do all these panels, and that's how it was basically an arms race, and that's how this sort of ecosystem, this award campaigning ecosystem, just ballooned and ballooned and ballooned.
Forgive my ignorance, but how does the voting work? Because it doesn't really go into it in the book. And the campaigning, for the Academy, can you kind of explain how does the voting work? Do you
Yeah,
know?
well, so there's about 10,000 people in the Academy right now, and they're all various professionals who reach a certain level in the industry, and they have different branches. Like the acting branch, the directing branch, cinematographers, etc. Everyone nominates in their particular branch. So the actors nominate for the acting categories, etc. And then everyone gets to pitch in on Best Picture. Really, it's about persuasion. I mean, it's not unlike a political campaign, where you have like different states who vote in various primaries, and you have to appeal to those people. And just like with a political campaign, there's the sort of the messaging, like stump speeches, and then there's the ground game, which is like going to, the state fairs and, shaking hands and kissing babies and all that. So with the Academy Awards, it's, the messaging is like, how do you craft, you know, in the ads for the movie and in the interviews that people are doing and the press they're getting, how do you position someone as like, is a certain actor like an old timer who's never gotten their due, or is someone a breakout star, or is a movie like a really important humanitarian message, or the most beautifully designed and crafted film of the year from like a master like Martin Scorsese. That's the messaging. And then the ground game is, who are these voters? There's like, a couple thousand people, and you have to get them, first of all, to watch the movie in order to nominate it. Like, that's the big hurdle. They have stacks of, screeners, and they now have an internet portal that they watch it online. But, you have to get their attention. Ideally, you want them to actually come out of the house and watch it on a big screen so that you can be awed by the beautiful craft. And so that's why you have these, stars of the movies hosting screenings and stuff like that, making appearances. Oh, you mean I can go watch Poor Things on a big screen and Emma Stone will be there? Okay, I'll leave my house and go. It's all about sort of capturing the attention of, each and every Academy member. And of course, the Academy has had to, over the years, rein in some of this. They're continually making new rules. It's sort of like campaign finance reform to try to make sure it doesn't get completely out of hand and corrupt.
There has been a lot of outcry for the 2024 Oscars because of Barbie, and that particularly about Barbie, because Margot Robbie did not get nominated for Best Actress, and Greta Gerwig did not get nominated for Best Director. And I was thinking, I'm like, well, they're both producers for Barbie, which is nominated for Best Picture. And if it wins for Best Picture, they would get the Oscar as producers.
Margot Robbie would, yeah. She's nominated as a producer. Greta Gerwig is nominated as a screenwriter with Noah Baumbach.
Okay,
so they both are nominated for other things.
For other things, not the main thing that they are known for. I thought Greta also produced it, but not. I guess you're right. Margot would get the Oscar if it won Best Picture, and then if it won Best, I think, Original Screenplay, Greta would win it along with.
It's actually an adapted, because it's adapted.
It's an adapted. I wasn't sure.
The doll Barbie.
I was like, which one is it? But
that was a controversial decision by the Academy to make it an adapted screenplay.
And I'm like, well, but did they have to like pick and choose? Because they were like, we can't. I'm wondering if they were thinking like, we have to be kind of wise about how many times they can nominate us in case we win too many times. Or do you have any ideas of why it wasn't nominated that many times, or those choices?
Well, the movie was nominated. It got 8 nominations. So I think it's sort of a mixed message. Like, Barbie certainly wasn't ignored. It got a lot of nominations, and some of them were surprise nominations, like America Ferrera in Best Supporting Actress.
Right.
So the acting branch made that choice, and then they didn't choose, or not enough people voted for Margot Robbie in Best Actress to be nominated there. So I feel like it's a sort of conflicted way of nominating Barbie. And I wrote about this for the New Yorker that day the nominations came out. I mean, it's a lot of things at once. It's, first of all, both of those categories are very competitive, and you have people like, Lily Gladstone, who I mentioned, who's, a trailblazing nominee in Best Actress, and, Martin Scorsese and Christopher Nolan and Justine Triet and Best Director. Each category has its own kind of like its own thing going on, its own sort of chemistry. And there are also different branches, as I mentioned, like who made those different choices. They're totally different people nominating for Best Director versus Best Actress. I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that Barbie is like a huge, fun blockbuster.
Yeah.
I think the Academy has traditionally not always embraced big populist kind of movies like that. It reminded me of Jaws in 1976,
Mm-hmm.
which was, of course, the biggest movie of its time and a big crowd pleaser. And it was nominated for Best Picture, but Steven Spielberg was snubbed for Best Director.
Right.
And that only got 4 nominations, but you could sort of tell that the Academy didn't quite know what to do with it. Barbie is also a comedy, and the Academy does not have a great track record,
No.
with comedies or comic performances. And then, of course, as many people pointed out, there's, a gender element to it. And, it's a very feminist movie. So it's a something you'd naturally point to. And Hillary Clinton sort of got on the bandwagon of, talking about it online. And certainly in the director category, that there has been a big gender barrier. I mean, there have been several female winners in the last couple of years, and this year has a female nominee, Justine Triet, for Anatomy of a Fall. But that doesn't explain what happened with Best Actress, because that's an all-female category.
Right.
Like Margot Robbie, she sort of lost out to other women, and including the first Native American
Which I
nominated
think
in the category.
is well deserved, because I love Marty, but that movie was way too long. However, Lily, she held her own. I'm like, she wears the pants in that relationship. While I'm watching, I'm like, she's holding her own against Leo and against Robert.
Absolutely.
So I
Yeah,
was
she's
like, she's
fantastic
going to
in
get
it.
nominated, if not win. And I was like,
Yeah.
that's a well deserved nomination. But it's an interesting thing, and that's what I was thinking. Like, I think it is a bit of a gender thing, because they're like, I don't know, it might be a little too much for Greta to get too many nominations. That was my theory. But I was like, oh, well, I'll be talking to Michael soon.
I think, I mean, maybe. I mean,
Could
certainly
be.
historically, if you look at the entire
Hmm.
history of like Best Director, there are not a lot of women in it. And there continue to be like, maybe one a year. Last year, I think there were no women in the category,
Right.
which is a real problem. But I also think that the directing branch is inclined more toward sort of dramas, toward,
Yeah.
I mean, this year you had 2 uh, international films, not just Anatomy of a Fall,
It's true.
but The Zone of Interest. Um, I think they just have a different bent in nominating the director of like a big, joke filled, like super fun comedy summer blockbuster is, yeah, I just don't know if that's where the taste of that branch lies. I don't think it's like a conspiracy. Let's not nominate Greta for too many things, because again, they're not the same people nominating for
That's
screenplay.
fair. Yeah.
So it's like a different branch. So it's like the optics of it are a certain thing, but when you look under the hood, it's just a little more complicated and a little harder to read.
You kind of talk about it in the book that you're like, theoretically, the Oscars is supposed to be about giving an accolade to art, the best in art. And art is quite subjective. It's not like sports where there is a clear winner, right? But
Mm-hmm.
we want to have a winner and all that stuff. And that's the thing, is we were like, when people were really upset about the Barbie nominations, and I'm like, guys, no one talks about Driving Miss Daisy. Everyone, we study Do the Right Thing, right? And who won the Oscar that year? And who did not get nominated for Best Director? It was Spike Lee. But we still actually study and talk about Do the Right Thing and which one's actually the better movie, arguably. So I was like, it's not about the nomination. At the end of the day, time will tell. But do you think that the Oscars, and we kind of touch it a little bit in the book by, like Alfred Hitchcock kind of has those, I'm trying to find it.
What's it, the Alfred Hitchcock thing is his term, the MacGuffin,
Mhm.
which is like at the beginning of the movie, like someone's car breaks down, or like, someone needs it's like the little plot device that just gets the story moving, but the real story is actually, like the woman they meet. The actual like meat of the story is not just this little thing on page 3 of the script. So the MacGuffin, in the book, I say that the horse race of what wins and what doesn't, that's kind of the MacGuffin. What interests me most about Oscar season is sort of what it reveals about the state of Hollywood at any given moment. And I think that if you look to the Oscars as a kind of perfect barometer of cinematic worth, of what is the best movie, what is the best performance, you're always going to be frustrated or disappointed because they're always getting it totally wrong. But if you look at the Oscars as a kind of magic mirror that shows you what Hollywood is thinking and how it sees itself, they're extremely interesting and extremely rich. And that's sort of how I try to write about the Oscars.
Yeah, and you did a great job, because at the end of the day, I was like, no one's going to change my mind if I still love the movie Spice World. Say what you will. It's a great movie. And then at the same time, like Shawshank Redemption is one of my favorite movies. Didn't win anything at the Oscars, or maybe it won a couple of things, but it didn't win Best Picture, and yet it's considered one of the best films of all time. Right. So it's a little weird kind of thing where when you necessarily, if it says Oscar winning whatever director or writer or whatever, it doesn't necessarily mean you are the actual best for everybody, right? Because it's art.
Well, yeah, and I think part of the fun of Oscar season is arguing over it. Like, art isn't meant to be ranked like sports. There are no clear winners. Like, you can't. It's sort of an impossible calculation. It's totally subjective, and yet I do think art is meant to be discussed. And Oscar season gives us all a platform to talk about what we liked in movies over the year, what we thought was the best movie or the best actor or the best actress. And I think disagreeing with the Academy and raging about what they got wrong and what they left off, and that's part of it. I think that's part of the fun.
Yeah.
And it's part of what engages us as moviegoers. So in that sense, it's every year there's going to be something, everything. There's going to be someone who's left off, and it, people go online to, rage against it and talk about how stupid the Academy is. That's the MacGuffin. It's like the Academy nominations get us all talking about what we thought about these movies.
Yeah, well, I mean, you did such a great job, and we didn't even touch on the real beginnings of it, which was really interesting. I mean, Frank Capra, and the start of it, or Bette Davis and her trying to get the Oscar and all sorts. It's so great to all those great things and all the cravings I had. I was like, oh no, I really want to watch this movie again. Or I'm like, I want to watch Sunset Boulevard. You did such a great job, and Oscar Wars is out now, wherever you can get books. And is there anything else that you want to share and promote?
Mostly the book, out in paperback. You can read all about Bette Davis and Sidney Poitier, all the way up through me watching the slap from the balcony and seeing Will Smith dancing at the Vanity Fair party to getting jiggy with it hours later with his Oscar, a huge smile on his face. It covers a lot of ground. And then also, my work's at the New Yorker. So anyone who wants to seek out my coverage of this year's Oscars, I will be there in March, and I'll be sort of reporting on my evening.
Well, thank you so much, Michael, for coming. And yes, I put on my movie star red lipstick just for this occasion. So yeah, thank you so much. Till next time.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to Media and Monuments, a service of Women in Film and Video. Please remember to review, rate, and subscribe wherever you listen to this podcast. For more information about WIF, please visit our website at wif.org. Media and Monuments is produced by Sandra Abrams, Candace Block, Brandon Ferry, and Tara Jabbari, and edited by Emma Klein and Jess Thompson. with audio production and mix by Steve Lack Audio. For more information about our podcast, visit mediaandmonuments.com.